On the cold winter night of November 4th, 1971, in Westfield, around 10 p.m., police arrive at the mansion of the List family. The entire house is lit up, with some lights flickering and others completely out. Neighbors have reported that the lights have been on continuously, accompanied by loud classical music playing without interruption. The teacher of John List's daughter, Patricia, has called the police after she hasn't attended school for nearly a month. After repeatedly knocking on the door with no response, the police force entry into the house. What they discover next is nothing less than a nightmare. John List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan. Raised as a Lutheran, he taught at a Sunday Christian school. He was often described as distant, weird, and cold, with very few friends. In 1943, he decided to serve in the U.S. Army as a laboratory technician during World War II. After returning from the Army, he completed a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in accounting at the University of Michigan. However, his lack of social skills often caused him problems, earning him a reputation for getting fired from various jobs. During this time, John met Helen, a woman with a complex personality marked by mental illness and alcoholism. They met at church, and soon after their relationship began, Helen told him she was pregnant. Due to his religious views, John felt compelled to marry her. However, shortly after their wedding, Helen confessed that she had lied about the pregnancy. Feeling betrayed yet still committed to his faith, John continued in the marriage. In 1951, despite their relationship instability, John and Helen had 3 children. The oldest daughter, Patricia, who was 16, John Jr., who was 15, and their youngest son, Frederick, who was 13. On the surface, John appeared to be the perfect son, husband, and father. Despite his social ineptitude, he worked hard as an accountant at a local bank to provide a good life for his family. By 1965, he managed to achieve a level of success that many Americans could only dream of, and the List family lived in a mansion with 19 rooms, embodying the American dream. Yet behind the scenes, things couldn't be further from the truth. It turns out, the List family couldn't actually afford their lifestyle. That's why John asked his mother, Alma, for a loan. Around this time, his father had passed away, which brought John and his mother closer together, and they agreed for her to move into the List mansion with him. For a little less than a year, things seemed fine, but then John's situation took a drastic turn. He got fired from his job at the bank, just like he had from his other jobs, due to his personality issues. Instead of admitting to his family what had happened, he decided to maintain appearances, continuing to dress for work and pretending everything was normal. He would take the train as if he were going to work, stopping at various stations to read magazines. When it was time to return home, he would take the train back, making it seem like he had been at work all day. Gradually, the family's expenses and the maintenance of the large mansion began to pile up. To cope, John started secretly withdrawing money from his mother's bank account. By 1971, he was buried in debt and completely bankrupt. This situation created a moral crisis for John, who believed poverty was a sin. He was particularly worried about his 3 teenagers, whom he thought were being influenced by the sinful culture of the 1970s in America. John was especially concerned about Patricia, as she expressed a desire to become an actress, a profession he considered immoral. Rumors circulated that she had experimented with marijuana and taken part in witchcraft. Meanwhile, Helen's health rapidly declined. She began experiencing regular seizures and losing vision in her right eye. In the winter of 1968, tests revealed that she had syphilis, contracted from her first husband. John discovered this later and silently calculated and considered this in his head for months. At times, he even contemplated suicide, but his religious beliefs deemed it an unforgivable sin. After enduring all of this, John ultimately concluded that the only way to save his family from sin and poverty was to kill them. On November 9th, 1971, after the kids leave for school, Helen wakes up and goes down for her typical morning cup of coffee. John says good morning to her. He then goes behind her, with a 9mm pistol and shoots Helen in the head, killing her on the spot. John puts her body on top of a sleeping bag to make it easier to drag to one of the rooms. After dragging Helen there, he goes upstairs to the 3rd floor where his mother, Alma, stays. Alma has prepared breakfast and asks John what that weird noise was that she heard below. He gives her an unclear answer, then puts a pistol to the left side of her head and pulls the trigger. Because Alma's body is too heavy, John simply puts a towel over her face and leaves her where she fell. Next, he cleans a substantial amount of blood from the kitchen and continues with his plan. John writes letters and makes phone calls to the school teachers of his kids, his boss, and others, stating that the family must leave to look after a sick relative in North Carolina. Afterward, he goes to the mail to send the letters and stop deliveries of supplies, like milk and newspapers. He then visits the bank and withdraws the last savings of his mother, totaling around $2,000. John returns to the mansion and makes himself a sandwich for lunch while waiting for the kids to come home. Patricia is first. She arrives earlier than usual because she wasn't feeling well. As she enters the house, John shoots her point blank in the jaw with his pistol, then drags Patricia to the room where Helen is. Afterward, Fred comes home. John shoots him the same way and again drags him to the room. His youngest son, John Jr., has a football match that day, and after murdering the whole family except him, John decides to go watch the game. Later, he picks up his son, and they both return home. Right when they get to the kitchen, he shoots John Jr. in the torso from the back. This time, unlike the others, John Jr. survives the shot and tries to fight for his life. However, his father shoots him 9 more times before dragging him to the room where the rest of the family members are. Following the killings, John cleans the blood as best as he can. Then he makes dinner and sits at the table. After eating, he cleans the dishes and leaves them to dry. Finally, he goes to sleep, claiming later in his life that he hadn't slept that well in years. The next morning, John shuts off the central heating to preserve the bodies and prevent the smell of decomposition. He turns on all the lights in the house and puts his favorite classical music radio station on max volume. John then sits in the kitchen and writes a 5-page letter to a priest. Also, I'm sure many will say, how could anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer is it isn't easy and was only done after much thought. One other thing, it may seem cowardly to have always shot from behind, but I didn't want any of them to know, even at the last second, that I had to do this to them. John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately out of pain. John didn't consciously feel anything either. Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them whether or not the government does its duty as it sees it. I'm only concerned with making my peace with God, and of this I am assured because of Christ dying even for me. After finishing the letter, he searches the mansion and cuts out his face from every family photo he finds. He walks out the door, locks it behind him forever, then heads to JFK Airport with his car, leaving it there. John then returns to New Jersey by bus and catches a train to Denver, disappearing. Almost a month passes, and at the start of December, Patricia's drama teacher becomes increasingly worried about her absence. He says, "I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible has happened to this family." He adds that he thought John List was a very strange person, but what worried him even more was Patricia's confession that she had a terrible feeling her father might kill the entire family. The drama teacher convinces a colleague that they should go to the List family's house to check on what's going on. Seeing the horrific atmosphere when they arrive, they immediately call the police. The first officers on the scene are policemen George Jelesnik and Charles Haller. They knock on the door and call out, but they don't get any response. The neighbors insist that they go in and check on what's happening. The two policemen find an unlocked window and enter the mansion from there. Inside, everything is shrouded in darkness except for a light coming from the upper floor. The air is cold. Loud classical music echoes throughout the house. As they search the empty rooms with their flashlights, the policemen find the area where John had dragged all of the bodies. When they reach the room's door, they are immediately hit with the smell of decomposing bodies. On top of sleeping bags on the floor, they find the bodies of Helen, Patricia, Fred, and John Jr. After searching the entire mansion, they discover a letter with instructions written on it, as well as the weapon used to murder the family. Following his instructions, they also find the body of his mother, Alma, on the upper floor. The authorities immediately put John List on a national search. But there was one problem. He had a full month head start. They find his car abandoned at JFK Airport, but there's no data about his flight or where he went. They end up with absolutely nothing. Over the years, police and authorities try to follow every possible clue to where John might be, but every lead leads to dead ends. The press and media also try to make his story as public as possible to draw attention, hoping to get help from the public and keep the story in the spotlight so it's not forgotten. They air the story on America's Most Wanted every significant year, the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 10th anniversaries. During one of those shows, a clay model of John List's face is included, made by Frank Pender. He creates it using FBI documents, where key details about his character are gathered based on how he committed the murders. This model is made with aging progression to show how he might look 18 years after the killings, as by then the case is inactive. But this is where things take a twisted turn. A woman who is a true crime enthusiast, obsessed with reading books and watching films about killers, watches one of these shows. She is absolutely horrified when she sees the model that looks like an exact one-to-one copy of her neighbor, Robert Clark. She immediately calls the police, and the authorities find out that he was peacefully living in Colorado, remarried, and under a new identity. On June 1st, 1989, John List is arrested after an 18-year hunt in an accounting office in Richmond. He defends his innocence for months, claiming they have the wrong guy, and he really is Robert Clark. But when detectives show him irrefutable evidence, including fingerprint matches from his military archives under his real name, John List, he eventually cracks. On February 16th, 1990, he admits that he is indeed John List and that he killed his entire family. A psychiatrist hired by the court diagnoses him with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, stating that, in his mind at that time, there were only two solutions to his problems: either to kill himself or murder his entire family. And by now, you know what he decided to do. He truly didn't believe there was another way out of his problems. On April 12, 1990, John List is convicted of the murder of his entire family. While in court, he doesn't seem to express remorse for what he did. His exact words are, "I feel like because of my psychological state at that time, I can't be held fully accountable for what happened. In the end, that doesn't really matter because he receives 5 life sentences." On March 21st, 2008, he dies due to complications from pneumonia at the age of 82, having served 18 years in prison.